refugees, as people who escaped on March 25th, 421, the ancient Roman world. Communities were starting to grow up on different islands. Canals had to be dredged to keep them seaworthy through with dig-out canals, and then land would be dumped onto the islands to expand the islands more. That's why the islands today are so close together. 453 bridges that linked an archipelago of islands. 118 different islands. And the wells that were sunk into the marshy islands could provide fresh water for the people.
Be cool.
I'll take a picture of it.
I'm not about to.
I'll take a picture of it.
I'm not about to. I'm not.
Yeah, you were.
There isn't a lot of land to produce food on. The Venetians were a community of businessmen, bring goods in. Those goods would then be bought and sold in Venice, and then they would be shipped on boats to markets in Italy or further away. There are 80-some different churches. New families were building new compounds. They were building churches because new families wanted their own churches. Doges were always elected. The Doge had certain powers, but he was hemmed in by these other elected officials called tribunes. There'd be at least 2 of them, there might be more, and their job was essentially to make sure that the Doge didn't overstep his authority. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans, particularly English gentlemen, traveled the principal cities of Europe, finish out his education, the Grand Tour. God blessed the Doge, and he blessed the government, but he wasn't the source of the power. This was a republic. It was the only republic left in Europe.
Ehi.
Lascia stare, buoni giorni.
Emperor Leo V, the emperor in Constantinople between 813 and 820, gave a present to the Venetians in the way of a relic, the body of Saint Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist. And he funded a church and a convent to San Zaccaria. The women of San Zaccaria, the most powerful women in Venice, would become the wealthiest and most powerful monastic establishment in Venice throughout all of its history. The island was just off of the Molo, which is the area where San Marco is. It's kind of the shoreline, the water of the Bacino. And if you stand at San Marco and you look out at the water, there you see the beautiful Pelagian now church of San Giorgio Maggiore. And it was that island, within sight of the Ducal Palace, just across the water. That island was given now to the Benedictines to have this monastery. The Venetians knew the sea, and all of the goods that came up through the Adriatic could unload at the head of the Adriatic at Venice, and then could make their way on the navigable rivers of Europe. Very good place to have a clearinghouse. Free enterprise drove everything. The Grand Canal, the natural large canal, riva, altum, high banks, islands that were a little higher, and they would build a wharf for their merchant ships that they would do business on. And the Doges moved the capital to Rialto in 811, in the middle of the lagoon. And this is really when Venice was born, between 811 and 827. Shortly after this, the emperor in Constantinople and Charlemagne made a deal, and Charlemagne agreed. Venice alone in Italy was not part of the Carolingian Empire. The Doge, he wanted to build up the city. The emperor had promised to give him money and workmen to help him build a new Doge's palace. St. Theodore was the patron saint of the Venetian lagoon, given to Venice by Constantinople. St. Mark has to do with Grotto, not with Rialto, Venice. St. Mark sent one of his disciples to Aquileia and Grotto. This disciple had actually become the first bishop there. In 827, it's bad news for the Venetians. The Pope, under the influence of the Franks, decreed that Aquileia and Grotto now restored. So who is the real successor of St. Mark? They're not going to have their church controlled by the Franks. So 2 years later, two merchants, probably sent there, were in Alexandria. They managed to steal the body of St. Mark, died in Alexandria, given to them because the Muslims were going to harm the body. They put it on their ship. The Muslims inspectors came on board because they knew that the body had been stolen and they wanted to recover it, that they hid the body in a big basket and they put on top of it pork. And since the Muslims wouldn't touch pork because it was unclean, they were able to get St. Mark away. The merchants returned to Venice now with the body of St. Mark. And that's going to change the whole debate. St. Mark, and in fact, it overshadows everything. The Doge orders the creation of a chapel just for the body. People of Venice have very close ties, both commercial ties, because they're doing a lot of business with the East, but also cultural ties with the Roman Empire in the East. But it did rely on the safe passage of those goods through the Adriatic. It was crucial that the Adriatic be a safe place to have merchant vessels. And as long as Constantinople was still able to have military vessels to police the waters, but as their power waned, more and more Venetian squadrons of warships were being sent out into the Adriatic to patrol against Dalmatian pirates. During the 830s, conditions in the Adriatic started to become really intolerable. Sicily was slowly coming under Muslim control, and more Muslim raiders, decades of hard-fought wars for the Venetians to finally gain control of the Adriatic. For them, after the 840s, Venice was their sea. It was the Sea of Venice. The water no longer defender. Venice managed staying strictly to its neutrality, but with the rise of Napoleon as a monarch toppler, in 1797, Napoleon's army was ready with heavy cannons, shell Venice, and the Republic of 1,000 years ceased to exist.